Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Victoria Bergeron. I am a policy researcher at the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, focused on early education and care. And I'm joined today by my colleagues, including Megan Callahan, our policy research director. And we are going to be going through some slides and information on the state budget process, an overview of the governor's FY 2026 budget proposals, a supplemental budget, and what that means for early education investments this coming year. So we'll pull up our slides and get going. Right, there we go. Okay, so again, thank you everyone for coming. We are recording, and please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go through. We will also hopefully have time for questions at the end, but if you have something while we're going through the slides, feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll try to get to it. So we'll be starting out with a overview of the state budget process, some fiscal context, a review of what happened last year in the state budget, and then an overview, big picture highlights of the bigger context of the governor's budget for FY 2026, and then I'll get into early education proposals. And then we'll tee up what's upcoming for the budget process again. I'll kick it to you, Megan.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. As Victoria said, my name is Megan Callahan. I'm the research director with MTF. And yeah, I'm going to get us started with a bit of Budget Process 101. This is the third year that MTF has been hosting this series of presentations on the state budget and the specific investments that it includes for early education and care. And we realized last year as we were putting together the governor's budget presentation that at this point in the year, it would be really helpful to do some of that level setting on what exactly is about to take place over the next 6 months and what are some key things to really know about the budget development process more generally before we get into the specifics. So the budget process can often feel like a lot of jargon and a bit of alphabet soup when we are working through all those acronyms. So a few of the terms that you are likely to hear used a lot over the course of the next 6 months, but that we're also going to use a lot in today's presentation, we have included here on this slide. And just to call out a few that I know I'm definitely going to repeat over and over again. The first is fiscal year. So the state budget calendar operates on a fiscal year schedule running from July 1st to June 30th, as opposed to a calendar year schedule of January to December. We're going to talk a lot about line items. Line items in the budget are those unique accounts for every program, department, and service that receives funding in the state budget. They all have a unique 8-digit code associated with them. An appropriation is the specific funding amount tied to those line items. And then the GAA, or the General Appropriations Act, this is often how we refer to the final budget once it gets signed into law. And so today I'm going to talk a lot about the FY25 GAA, and in that I'm referring to the budget signed into law last July by Governor Healy. A few other terms on this slide, but we'll share this as a resource for you folks after the fact. If at any point throughout the slides I'm using a word or a phrase that's unfamiliar to you, please feel free to put a question in the chat and we can try to provide clarity or explain what we're talking about as soon as possible. And then in terms of what the budget actually looks like, if you were to pull up the budget that was filed by Governor Healy a couple weeks ago, we thought it would be helpful to decode some of the pieces of line item language that we see included in there. And the first thing that I'll say is that the budget is a legislative document. And so like any bill, it's organized into sections. And the section that we talk the most about is Section 2, which includes all the funding, all the direct appropriations included in the budget proposal. That section is organized by both State Department and line item. And so here we have an example of a relatively short and straightforward line item included in the budget, but each of these pieces of the line item you'll see included for every program. So first on the left, we have that line item number, that 8-digit code that every program or service is identified by in the state budget. On the right-hand side, we have the appropriation, that funding level. And then in the middle, we have the line item language. And for every line item that's in the budget, there's going to be some level of language included to describe how that funding is intended to be used. Although the degree of specificities can sometimes vary depending on the program that we're talking about. One piece of language that we often see included and that we spend a lot of time talking about, particularly as the process moves into the legislature, is earmark language. An earmark language is a specific funding amount identified within the appropriation that's tied to a specific community, a project, or a program. And so here, for example, we see a $100,000 earmark for an intern pipeline program in the Senate. But earmarks can vary. We see them all across the budget, including in many line items under the Department of Early Education and Care. And so if you're wondering what that looks like, we wanted to provide this example. All right, and so then to get into the steps that this process is going to follow over the next 6 months, I'm going to talk about them at a high level here, and then I have slides that go into a greater amount of detail that follow. So the state budget process really runs from December and January through July, and it kicks off with what's known as the consensus revenue hearing and the resulting consensus revenue agreement. I'm going to talk about the consensus revenue agreement for fiscal year 26, this year's budget, in greater detail later on. But what you need to know about it is that it's a really important part in the process in which the administration, the House, and the Senate all agree on the base amount of tax revenues that are going to be available to support spending in the upcoming fiscal year. And so the establishment of this consensus revenue agreement ensures that at least when it comes to tax revenues, the administration and the House and the Senate are all operating off of the same foundation of available resources. After the consensus revenue agreement is set, we have the governor's budget, which typically comes out in the third week of January. So on January 22nd is when we saw the governor file her proposal for this year. And then the process really moves into the legislature, and it remains in the legislature's hands for the next 5 or 6 months. So from February to April, the House and the Senate are actively reviewing the governor's budget proposal. They're meeting with stakeholders, and they're developing their own unique spending recommendations. In April, we see the House Ways and Means Committee release their budget proposal. That's typically around the second or third week of April. From there, House members have an opportunity to file amendments to that committee budget. And then House debate takes place for about 3 to 4 days before the House final budget is completed. Very quickly, then we move into the Senate. The Senate Ways and Means budget typically comes out in early May. Again, senators have an opportunity to file amendments to that committee proposal, and then the Senate debates their budget usually in the week leading up to Memorial Day. Once the House and the Senate have each finalized their own respective budget proposals, we go into the conference committee process, and that's when the House Committee and Senate Committee on Ways and Means are working to reconcile any and all differences between those two unique proposals. And that can include everything from large funding and policy differences to tiny wording differences within those line items. The ultimate goal is for the conference committee to get a final conference report to the governor's desk by July 1st, which is the first day of that new fiscal year. And from there, the governor has 10 days to either sign the budget into law or send back amendments or vetoes to the budget proposal. And the legislature can take some steps from there to override those vetoes. So at a very high level, that's the process. As I mentioned, now my following slides will go into each of those steps in a little detail. I'll go through some of them faster than others, but I'll try to highlight the ones in which stakeholders and the public have more of an opportunity to engage in the process, because I think that can be really helpful. So the governor's budget, I won't spend much time here. We just discussed, we saw Governor Healy's FY26 proposal filed 2 weeks ago on January 22nd. Now we're into the legislature, and one of the first events that the legislature will undertake to better understanding what's included in the governor's budget are what are called Joint Ways and Means Committee hearings. These committee hearings are hosted by both the House Ways and Means and Senate Ways and Means committees, and they offer an opportunity for legislators to hear directly from the governor and her administration on the funding proposal that's been filed and what those funding and policy proposals really mean for the services that can continue into the next fiscal year. These committee hearings are also open to the public. They're hosted across the state and typically organized around policy area or secretariat. And so they can be a really great resource to hear directly from the folks in the administration who are going to be responsible for administering these funding and policy proposals. Occasionally, it's also an also an opportunity for the public and other advocates and stakeholders to testify on what they see as really important for legislators to consider in the budget moving forward. These typically take place in February and March. The Joint Ways and Means Committee hearings for this year's budget cycle haven't yet been set, but we can try to keep people posted on when those dates are secured. At the same time that the Joint Ways and Means hearings are taking place, the House and Senate, as I mentioned, are actively working through developing their own unique spending proposals. We'll see the House really go through their budget process over the month of April and the Senate throughout the course of May. What I'll talk about here is that after the respective committee budgets are filed, that's when House members and Senate members each have an opportunity to file those amendments, which get considered during debate, which I'll get into in greater detail on my next slide. One other thing I'll point out here is that what we often see that's different in the House Ways and Means and Senate Ways and Means budgets compared to what we see in the governor's budget is first a bit more specificity in the line item language. That's purposeful. The legislature will typically prefer to be more prescriptive in how they want funding to be used because they don't have the same level of oversight as the administration in working directly with agencies and departments on actually getting this funding out the door. And so they're going to include a lot more language to make sure that this funding is being used how it's intended to be. The other thing that's different is that the committee budgets will often reflect more advocate requests, and those are a direct result of the stakeholder and advocate meetings that they're having during this time, as well as some of the information that they're able to gather through those Joint Ways and Means hearings. All right, budget debate comes after the committee budgets. So in both the House and the Senate, it's not atypical to see members file over 1,000 amendments to their respective committee proposals. And over the course of 3 to 4 days, both the House and the Senate are working through these amendments and trying to come to agreement on how they can adjust what's ultimately included in their final budget proposals. The amendments that get filed by legislators reflect a range of priorities. We see a lot of earmark amendments funding for those local priorities in specific communities, but we'll also see amendments for large outside section policy proposals or increases to large statewide programs. So this is a really exciting part of the process. We follow this every day as debate is going on. It can sometimes be difficult to understand exactly what's happening during any given day of debate. If, as we move through this process, people have questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We're really tracking amendment by amendment, kind of what's taking place and what ultimately ends up in the final budget. All right, we have the House final budget, we have the Senate final budget. Now is when we move into the conference committee process. And as I mentioned, this is when every single difference between those two proposals has to get reconciled by a committee of ultimately 6 members. We have 3 members from the House and 3 members from the Senate, led by the respective chairs of the Ways and Means committees. And every difference from where a comma is placed in the line item language to what the ultimate funding level is for a program has to be reconciled before getting that conference report to the governor's desk by July 1st. July 1st is obviously always the goal. We're not always successful in meeting that goal. Last year, the final budget wasn't signed into law by Governor Healy until July 31st. So we can move past that July 1st deadline sometimes. From there, this is when the governor has those 10 days to review the final budget that's sent to her desk. She can sign it into law, then it becomes known as the General Appropriations Act. She can also send back spending and policy vetoes. Last year, the governor returned to the legislature 59 spending vetoes and 3 outside policy section amendments. The legislature can choose to override those vetoes with 2/3 majority votes in each chamber. Last year, we didn't see any of the vetoes ultimately overridden by the legislature. So that was a quick review of the budget process, kind of what we can expect in the next 6 months. I can pause quickly to see if there are any questions there before we get into some of the more specific spending and revenue trends. Any questions, Victoria?
I don't see anything in the chat yet, but feel free to put questions in as we go through, folks.
Okay, perfect. So now, before we get to what we see in the FY26 budget proposal, what we thought would be really helpful was to take a step back and talk about some of the bigger spending and revenue trends that we've seen impacting the Commonwealth over the last 5 years or so. We often talk about the state budget in the context of one fiscal year or one budget proposal, but a lot of times these larger trends can offer some of that context that I think is really helpful to understanding kind of the situation that we're in right now. So these next few slides really aim to do that and then we'll get into what we're seeing specifically in the governor's proposal. So first, if we take a step back and we think about how the Commonwealth both recovered from and responded to the pandemic, what we see is that state tax revenue collections have really been on a little bit of a roller coaster ride over the last 5 or 6 years. Between FY20 and FY21, so in the years immediately during and following the pandemic, state tax revenue collections increased by over $11 billion, 40% growth in just 2 years. Since that time, FY22 to FY25, we've seen revenues basically hold flat. We have remained ahead of what pre-pandemic trends would have suggested revenue collections would look like, and that's illustrated by the yellow line in this chart. But what I think is interesting to point out is that if we just look at base state tax revenue collections, which are the dark blue bars in this chart, even in FY25, our current fiscal year, we don't expect those base tax revenues to exceed what was collected in FY22. And so the way that we've kind of been describing this is we had exponential growth from FY20 to FY22. And really, since then, state tax revenue collections have kind of been treading water. And that can be a difficult dynamic to think about at the same time that we're thinking about the spending increases and the needs that have increased over the same time period. So that's really helpful kind of big picture context to keep in mind. And just to talk about that in a slightly different way, between FY20 and FY22, state tax revenues were growing at an average annual rate of about 18%. In the 2 years immediately preceding that, prior to the pandemic, revenues were growing by about 3% each year. And in the 2 years since FY22 to FY24, we've seen revenues basically hold flat and actually decrease slightly by about 0.42%. Now, it's important to note that the flat revenue growth that we've been experiencing over these most recent fiscal years is on top of what is now a much higher base in overall state revenue collections, really buoyed by that initial growth that we saw between FY20 and FY22. But still, again, you can imagine the difficult kind of challenges that arise when we have flat revenue growth at the same time that we're seeing spending needs increase pretty dramatically. And so just to look at how state spending trends kind of responded to those revenue trends that we just reviewed, the increased collections between FY20 and FY22 led to significant increases in spending in the annual operating budget. And in FY23 and FY24, we saw year-over-year spending growth increase by 9.1% and 6.9% respectively. Now, it's important to point out these are balanced budgets. They were supported by the resources that were available at the time. But these year-over-year cost increases do annualize, and they get carried forward from year to year, and they become much harder to sustain when we start to see those revenue collections decline. And that's exactly what we saw start to happen beginning really in FY23 and into FY24. And so keeping that in mind, one of the major goals that we had during last year's budget process was to realign spending increases with expected revenue growth. And ultimately, the budget that was signed into law by Governor Healy was successful in doing that. It was built off this assumption that revenues would grow by about 3.5% over the prior year. And the spending growth that we saw in the budget was about 3.1%. So that was a much more closer alignment of how we thought revenues would increase and where we saw spending grow at the same time. Now, this is going to continue to be a priority for lawmakers moving forward, is to keep these two things as close together as possible to ensure the long-term sustainability of our operating budget. Now we'll review quickly kind of what we saw in the FY25 budget, and I'll let Victoria to talk specifically about what we saw for EEC at the end of 25, because again, that's helpful context to keep in mind when we start to think about the Gov's budget in just a minute. But last year, where we saw the biggest areas of growth in the budget were in healthcare, education, and support services. In the case of healthcare, this was really driven by the state's mass health program. We're going to see that come back around in FY26 as well. That's another big area of spending growth in this year's budget. And then in terms of education, a lot of this is driven by the availability of those income surtax or fair share revenues. That's been a huge source of new spending support in the education category. And then the other thing that we can think about here are some of those larger education programs that we've seen come onto the budget in recent years. That includes things like C3 stabilization grants, but also things related to K-12, like the implementation of the Student Opportunity Act. And now I'll let Victoria talk quickly about some of the specific investments that we saw for EEC in FY25.
Sure, thanks, Megan. So just want to kind of remind folks some of the highlights that were included in the budget last year. Um, First, early education overall was funded at $1.42 billion in FY 2025. C3 received continued funding of $475 million. And the program was also codified into state law through an outside section in the budget. Other outside sections also codified childcare financial assistance, an educator loan forgiveness program, early educator scholarship program, and some other policy proposals that were included in a Senate early education bill last session. A couple other things to keep in mind is that, as Megan mentioned, the income surtax has been very helpful for early education investment growth. And surtax was used to support CPPI, C3, provider reimbursement rates, and CCFA last year. So we'll see some of those themes continued in this year's budget. And then also we wanted to mention a closeout supplemental budget that was passed at the end of last year to kind of tie up loose ends and for FY 2024. And there were a couple important provisions included in there related to early education. There were funds to support income eligible caseloads. $2.5 million to support additional rate increases for center-based providers. And then the last two bullets there are related to C3. So in the FY 2025 budget, they established a new online lottery system whose revenues can be used to support C3 through this new early education and care operational grant fund that they also established through last year's budget. But they needed funds to be able to get the online lottery up and running. So the supplemental budget for FY 2024 included $2.5 million to implement online lottery. And we're not expecting revenues to come in from that until maybe middle of FY 2026 is what we've heard, which is why the legislature also included a deposit of $150 million from the income surtax that was over the cap that they set for FY 2024 to be deposited into that operational grant fund to make sure that C3 was able to be fully funded. And speaking of surtax,
Great. So this is, oops,
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
This is our last kind of table setting slide before we can get into the specifics of FY26. But I think all of this is just really helpful to have in the back of your mind as we start to get into those specific investments. Victoria mentioned that on the same day that Governor Healy filed her FY26 budget proposal, she also filed a supplemental spending bill that appropriates what we call above cap surtax collections over and above the threshold that was set to be spent in the FY24 operating budget. So just kind of to map out kind of where those funds are coming from and what we actually see being appropriated in the governor's supplemental spending bill. In FY24, total surtax revenue or fair share collections were about $2.46 billion. Policymakers agreed to spend $1 billion of those in the FY24 GAA. So 1.46 billion in above cap resources were then redistributed in a couple different ways. As Victoria just mentioned, 150 million of them sent to the EEC Operational Grant Fund off the top. And then the remaining amount is split between two other trust funds. 15% of the remaining amount, about $200 million, was sent to the Surtax Reserve Fund, which is kind of like a mini stabilization fund for surtax supported investments. And then the remaining 85%, or about 1.1 billion, was sent to the Education and Transportation Innovation and Capital Fund. That 1.1 billion in resources in the Innovation and Capital Fund, plus about 200 million in surtax revenues collected in FY23, the first fiscal year in which the surtax was in place for about 6 months. Combined, that makes $1.3 billion available in the Innovation and Capital Fund. And those are the resources that we see the governor appropriating in her supplemental surtax spending bill, which is a bit of a mouthful. So I apologize for having to repeat that throughout the presentation. But that's where those resources are coming from. So as we're talking about the surtax spending we see in the gov's budget, plus what we see in the supplemental spending bill, we thought it would be helpful to just clarify kind of what's coming from what. All right, so now to get into those specifics, now that we have kind of all the relevant background, I'll talk high level on what we see in the gov's budget, revenue, and then I'll send it over to Victoria to detail the EEC spending that we see. So high level, the 5 things to know about this year's budget proposal from the governor. The first is that spending in the governor's budget is growing significantly over the FY 2025 GAA. It's increasing over the budget signed into law last July by Governor Healy by over $4 billion, or about 7.4%. But when we look at how the FY26 proposal compares to where the administration actually estimates FY25 spending will end up, the increase is much smaller, only about $2 billion over the current fiscal year, an increase of about 2.1%. So you might see in some of the reporting on the gov's budget a difference in how that spending growth is talked about. And this is really kind of what's driving that difference, whether you're comparing it to last year's budget as signed into law or where the administration really expects spending to end up at the end of the fiscal year. The second thing to note is that surtax or fair share revenues are a major source of new revenue and spending growth in the budget. So we see the amount of surtax spending included in the gov's budget increase to 1.95 billion. That's an increase of about 650 million over the surtax spending included in last year's budget. And then that spending is complemented by that 1.3 billion in supplemental spending that we just touched on briefly. In order to support spending growth of this level year over year, we also see the governor's budget rely on about $1.3 billion in trust fund and other one-time resources. In total, there's almost $2 billion in kind of new revenue generating initiatives in the governor's budget. And we estimate that about 1.3 billion of those are strictly one-time in nature. We also see some initiatives to generate revenue through some tax-related policy changes, a few of which you may have heard about or seen covered in the news recently. And then in terms of outside section policies, the governor's budget really runs the gamut. There's a diverse array of policy proposals put forward, including things that aim at limiting costs, generating revenues, but also some additional policy proposals that you may have heard mentioned, like limiting the payment of rental brokers' fees, and also creating a new state and local camera enforcement program for speeding. So really a wide variety of proposals in the outside sections. Now, just quickly to go through kind of the revenues and resources used to support spending in the governor's budget. I talked earlier about the importance of this consensus revenue agreement, this setting of the foundation of the base tax revenues available to support spending in the next fiscal year. This year, the administration, House, and Senate agreed that non-surtax revenues, so revenues not related to the fair share agreement, were going to increase by about 2.2% over the prior year. In total, that gives them about $900 million in new base tax revenues available to support spending. It's important to note, though, that this $900 million increase doesn't reflect some of the pre-budget transfers that get automatically taken off the top before we start to consider some of the spending included in the budget. So that includes things like automatic transfers of sales tax revenue to the MBTA or the MSBA, as well as transfers to the Workforce Training Trust Fund or the state's pension liability. Once we take into those account, the consensus tax revenues actually available to support budgeted spending in FY26 are about $32.9 billion. And that's an increase of only 144 million over what was available in FY 2025. And that is a very small amount of new base revenues available to support spending. And I think one of the main reasons why we see the governor's budget reflect this range of revenue generating initiatives, and we see its reliance on some one-time sources of revenue as well. Of course, the income surtax does provide that new source of revenue to support spending above and beyond what was capable in FY25. In FY26, as I mentioned, that surtax spending cap increases to 1.95 billion, 650 million over what was included in FY25, 1.3 billion. But still, I'll point out, and this is purposeful, the cap is set at a level less than total revenue collections are projected for the surtax, which are about 2.4 billion for FY26. The fact that the surtax spending cap is slightly lower than overall revenue projections is purposeful, and the intention is so that there can be a little bit of above cap revenues that can ensure that the level of surtax spending in the operating budget is sustainable, but also so that we can continue to capitalize some of those other surtax funds that I mentioned, like the Innovation and Capital Fund, which can then be used to support supplemental spending initiatives.
Megan, we had a question in the chat, I think a few slides back,
Sure.
to clarify the information about the FY 2026 proposal being 4.3 billion over FY 2025 GAA, but only 1.8 billion over estimated spending for FY 2025. Just kind of that distinction there.
Sure, let me back up so that I can pull up that bullet point. So that's bullet point number one. So the difference here is when we talk about comparing spending in the governor's budget to the budget signed into law last July by Governor Healy, that's the FY25 GAA. And between those two proposals, spending is increasing by $4 billion or 7.4%. The administration over the course of FY25, and this happens every fiscal year, anticipates the actual amount of spending to increase above and beyond what was included in that budget that was signed into law last summer. That's why throughout the fiscal year, we often see supplemental budgets come up to address those increased costs. The 1.8 billion or 2.1% growth is comparing the governor's budget proposal to that ultimate number where the administration expects spending to land after we take into account some of those supplemental spending requests that typically come up throughout the fiscal year. Does that offer some clarity, hopefully?
Yep, I think that's perfect. And we'll also come back to that idea as well a little bit.
Great, perfect. So just quickly then, before I hand it over to Victoria, this 2 billion or so in revenue generating initiatives that the Healy administration taps to help support spending above and beyond FY25. I won't go through line item by line item what all these initiatives are, but this is a resource that will be in the slides for folks to take a look at when we send them out. But again, the main point here is that I think we see this level of revenue generating and one-time resources tapped by the administration because of those challenges that we see with very limited revenue growth, but very real spending demands in FY26. And so you can see they kind of run the gamut. And of this 1.9 billion, we estimate 1.3 billion are really one-time in nature. That's an increase in the amount of one-time resources to support budgeted spending from FY25 by about 1/3 or 300 million. And this is a number that we think it's important to pay attention to because when resources are one-time in nature, that means that they're not going to be available next year. And so next year, when we're all meeting again to talk about the governor's proposal for FY27, one of the first things that we'll be talking about then is how we replace this 1.3 billion in revenues used to support spending this year that are no longer going to be available in future years. And so this can just create some challenges with the overall long-term structural balance of the budget, which is why we spend a fair amount of time talking about it now. But that's the information on revenues and resources used to support the governor's budget. Spending at a very high level. I mentioned when we break it down by category, we see the largest spending increases in healthcare, also education, support services, and transportation. Healthcare, once again, really driven by increases to the state's mass health program. Education and transportation, you can see as illustrated by this light blue portion of the bar chart here, a lot of these year-over-year spending increases are made possible by the availability of new income surtax revenues. And then support services, these are often driven by things like the annualization of what are called Chapter 257 rate increases, which are rate increases for human service providers that work with the state.
Megan, we had another question in the chat
Sure.
about kind of the historic revenue picture and the high revenue collections that we saw during the pandemic in 2021, and then the decline since then of revenue collections. And the question is if there are any kind of specific economic or policy factors that we can think of that have kind of created that change the past few years.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think first, the increased revenue collections that we saw between FY20 and FY22, those are really driven by a much stronger stock market than what was anticipated when we were initially kind of responding to and recovering from the pandemic. So a huge portion of that, I mentioned $11 billion increase in revenue collections over that 2-year time period was driven by what are known as capital gains collections, which are really can be a volatile source of revenue, but really also track pretty closely to performance of the stock market. Since FY22, as we've seen revenue collections level out, a huge part of that loss has been decreasing capital gains collections. And so I think the trends that we've seen over the last few years have really just been in response to kind of the volatile nature of the stock market during that same time period. Great. All right, my last slide before handing it over to Victoria. Again, because we're going to talk about surtax spending throughout the rest of the presentation and really how both the governor's budget and the supplemental budget work together to support education and transportation investments. We wanted to offer kind of a summary look here at all of the surtax spending that's been included to date in the operating budget, which with the introduction of the 1.95 billion surtax spending cap in FY26 is about $4.25 billion over the last 3 fiscal years. And that funding in the operating budget has been weighted more heavily towards education than transportation. It's been a division of about 60% for education, 40% for transportation. What's important to flag, though, and we note this in some of the reports that we've already put out on the governor's budget, is that when we think about the governor's budget proposal for FY26, alongside the supplemental budget proposal filed on the same day using surtax resources, funding for education and transportation between those two spending proposals is essentially equal, 50% going towards education and 50% going towards transportation. So that's just another piece of context that we think is helpful to flag for folks as well as it relates to the surtax. But with that, I'll pass it over to Victoria to talk about EEC.
Thank you, Megan. And thank you, everybody, for putting questions in the chat. Feel free to continue to do so as we go through, and we should have some time at the end as well. So I'm just going to be going through a bit of a deep dive of the early education investment proposals that the governor is putting forward, both in her FY 2026 operating budget and in the supplemental surtax budget as well. Next slide, yes, thank you. So top 5 things to know. EEC is funded in the governor's budget at $1.7 billion, which is roughly a 10% increase compared to FY 2025 GAA. C3 is again level funded at $475 million. CCFA is funded at a total of about $1.1 billion in the governor's budget, which takes into account base funding for the DCF, DTA, and income eligible CCFA programs, as well as an additional $98 million in income surtax that are also directed to support CCFA. CPPI is roughly level funded in the governor's budget at $17.7 million. However, we are also thinking about the added context of the surplus surtax supplemental budget, which directed an additional $50 million to CPPI from that innovation and capital fund that Megan talked about. And then finally, also in the supplemental budget is $100 million for broad initiatives to support early education, workforce, affordability, and quality initiatives. So I'm going to be digging into each of these pieces in the following slides. So this chart gives total GAA spending for EEC since FY 2020. And especially due to increased investments like C3 since the pandemic and just the increased importance that the state has placed on funding early education at the state level, the department has seen its funding increase by about $855 million between FY 2020 and FY 2025. And especially as we've been talking about, as revenues have been leveling off the past few years, and there's kind of a renewed sense of spending constraint overall in the budget. This is an incredibly significant amount of growth that we're continuing to see. So I'll touch on each of the programs in the chart again in a few slides later on, but this might be helpful for people to return to later on if you like a big picture breakdown of the governor's FY 2026 appropriations for education. Notably, I'd like to highlight again the increase in surtax resources being used to support EEC, which I'll also break down in the next slide. And then again, we are trying to think about both the FY 2026 operating budget and that supplemental budget as well. Perfect. So, as in past fiscal years, the governor's budget relies on spending supported by income surtax as well as trust fund resources dedicated to early education. In FY 2026, the governor proposes using surtax to support C3 as well as CCFA. And the operational grant trust fund that as I mentioned, was created in FY 2025 and the FY 2025 budget is also used to support C3 again in the governor's proposal. Notably, the governor's budget does not include drawing from the high quality and affordability early education and care trust fund, which has been used the past fiscal years in FY 2024 and FY 2025 to support C3. So that is not included in the governor's budget, and there's $65 million left in that fund as well. So we could see that come up in the House and Senate, but right now, the only trust fund the governor is using for early education and care is that operational grant fund. In total, the governor proposes using $488 million in non-general fund resources to support early education investments. Thanks, Megan. So, like we've been talking about, alongside the governor's operating budget for FY 2026, we have this supplemental budget that is being used to distribute approximately $1.3 billion from the Innovation and Capital surtax fund. And like in the operating budgets, these funds must be used for education and transportation investments, but these might also be more one-time capital project related in nature, which is why, as Megan mentioned, we see a greater share of the supplemental budget going to transportation, while education investments receive a larger share in the operating budget. So this is the first time that the governor and the legislature are filing this surplus surtax supplemental budget. And we'll be watching how this process plays out, as it will likely, as Megan has talked about, set the stage for future spending of surplus surtax funds in later years. Overall, in the supplemental budget, early education receives $150 million. Again, as I mentioned, that's to support CPPI and some broader education investments. Now I will be going into C3 and just wanted to give folks a historical picture of the funding breakdown for C3, which was originally, as many folks probably know, a federally funded program created in 2021 to distribute pandemic era stabilization funds. And Massachusetts is the only state that has been able to maintain their stabilization program since federal funds expired. So you can see that starting in FY 2023, the state began taking on that cost of the program. And now in FY 2026 will be the third fiscal year where C3 is fully funded by the state. But you'll see this kind of transition period has been marked by multiple resources being used to support the program, like the income surtax and both of those early education trust funds. In FY 2026, the governor proposes funding C3 with $85 million in general fund resources, $115 million from the Operational Grant Trust Fund, and $275 million in surtax resources for a total appropriation of $475 million. So something we anticipate discussions coming forward as the Senate and House deliberate and create their budgets is kind of this total funding level for C3 and the sustainability and effectiveness of the program at this level of funding as more providers are potentially participating and as grant distribution shift with CCFA participation and caseload effects as well. Another thing to watch as the budget goes through the legislature, as Megan mentioned, is kind of other program and reporting language that the House and Senate could include. So we'll be tracking that as well as the different funding proposals for C3. On to CCFA now. Non-surtax supported CCFA is funded at $965.8 million. That's base funding at $448.2 million for the DCF and DTA programs and $517.6 million for the income eligible program. As I mentioned, the governor also proposes an additional $98 million in surtax investment to support CCFA capacity and rates. We also wanted to kind of give a little more context around the big picture with CCFA funding in this budget. The FY 2026 proposal from the governor is about $192 million higher than CCFA base funding in FY 2025, not including the surtax. But as we talked about earlier, we are also taking in the context of the estimated spend amounts for FY 2025, in addition to what the appropriation was in the GAA. So in orange on the chart on the left, you can see that the administration is expecting increases in CCFA spending for FY 2025 beyond the FY 2025 GAA. And there could be several factors contributing to the higher costs for the programs, but increasing caseload over the past couple of years is certainly among them. We've seen 10,000 more kids, more than 10,000 more kids added to the caseload since the pandemic. And the department is serving more kids than ever before. So that coupled with additional rate increases in the past few years that are being annualized could be contributing to that estimated spend. So what we see in the governor's proposal for C3 is really in line with maintaining the level of funding that the state is expected to need in FY 2025. So ultimately, the governor's, you can go next slide, Megan, thank you. Ultimately, the governor's FY 2026 funding levels are sufficient to maintain current CCFA capacity levels and rate increases that were put into effect the past few years. But likely it will not be enough to expand access significantly. And the governor's budget does not include funding for additional rate increases. I'm going to pause and take a look at the chat quickly. Okay, so I see a question on CCFA about the federal funding that goes into the program. And we do have some information on that. I can put that in the chat at the end here, showing the federal dollars that come in through the Child Care Development Block Grants for CCFA. And then Catherine, a question on the wait list, when that will stabilize. So yes, there are 20,000, 30,000 kids on the wait list currently for income eligible care. And at current funding levels, we don't see an ability for access to open for the wait list beyond continuity of care and some other priority populations as well. But happy to talk about that further. Okay, quickly, 10 more minutes. On to CPPI, which I noticed there's some questions in the chat as well on. So the governor proposes $17.7 million for the maintenance of the current CPPI program, and an additional $50 million is proposed in the supplemental budget to be able to expand the program over multiple years to additional cities, additional gateway cities under the administration's Gateway to Pre-K program. And also wanted to talk about Head Start. There's been a lot of information coming at everybody from the presidential administration that could relate to Head Start and caused a lot of confusion last week. So just wanted to pull back and talk about that here, but also encourage folks to reach out to the Massachusetts Head Start Association, who's tracking this information more closely. In terms of the state budget, so the state budget allocates supplemental grants for Head Start, and the governor's proposal includes $18.5 million for those supplemental state grants. which is level with FY 2025 levels. But ultimately, Head Start is a federally funded program, so we'll be watching to see if there's more information coming out of Washington about federal grants and federal funded programs. Like we heard last week, the Trump administration put out and then rescinded a memo which authorized a spending freeze for federal grant and aid programs, caused a lot of confusion. But we are continuing to track this and again, encourage folks to reach out to the Massachusetts Head Start Association if you hear anything. Lastly, just wanted to highlight some notable workforce related pieces in the budgets. First, Career Pathways is funded at $5 million in the operating budget. Wanted to highlight that the governor's proposal does not include funding for the early educator loan forgiveness and scholarship programs that were established in the FY 2025 budget. So these were funded at $7.5 million each in the FY 2025 budget, and the programs were codified through outside sections. However, language and statute does not guarantee funding for a program. And in the governor's budget, we did not see those funding levels included again. And then finally, just lifting up that $100 million proposed investment from the supplemental budget, which could be used to support workforce affordability and quality improvements. There's also language in the supplemental budget that allows that funding to be transferred to the Operational Grant Trust Fund as well to potentially support C3. So just to conclude on what's next, go for it, Megan.
Awesome. Thank you. So, in terms of what's next, circling back to kind of where we started, the budget process is now in the hands of the legislature, where, as I mentioned, it's going to be for the next 5 or so months. So, things to look out for. The scheduling of those Joint Ways and Means hearings are going to offer a really great opportunity for people, again, to hear directly from the governor and her administration on the funding levels and policy proposals included in the House One proposal and what they mean for the programs and services funded by the state. We're going to be tracking this process as it moves through both the House and Senate committee debate and finalization processes. And we'll be back with more information on the EEC funding included in each of those proposals. And then we'll be with you through until conference committee and the finalization of the budget as well. But with that, I know we still have some questions in the chat, Victoria. We've had a couple questions about the percent of EEC funding that's federal versus state. Is there a slide in the appendix that would be helpful for me to pull up to maybe answer some of those questions?
See, I'm not sure if we have it in here, but I know we do have a chart on that and some other materials that we could find to send out to people.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll put some links in the chat on the funding related to Head Start and the CCDF as well that we were able to find for folks.
Great.
Also,
We had another question about the CPPI grants and just what some of the new funding would mean for opening up applications for the remaining gateway cities. I think, Victoria, but jump in if I'm incorrect. A lot of that I think is kind of yet to be seen. We'll need to see how the legislature responds to the governor's proposal to provide some supplemental surtax funding for CPPI. But we can look into this and follow up with kind of more specific information as some of the details maybe firm up as the budget moves through the process.
yeah, exactly. I think it's the administration's goal that all gateway cities would be able to participate in the program by the end of FY 2026. So that $50 million appropriation in the supplemental budget we see as working towards that goal. And something else. Yeah, gateway cities. Feel free also, folks, raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question outside of the chat. And I'll put in another link for federal funding.
And then Amy also very helpfully pointed out that Victoria is kind of on a presentation circuit this week on the details that we have for EEC funding. So she's going to be joining the 9:30 call on Thursday, where she'll be able to review this spending that we see again, and maybe get into some questions that folks had during this presentation as well.
Looking forward to it. Susie, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I just had, can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I just had that question in the chat that got lost, I think, just about any data about the workforce development programs and how they may or may not have increased the number of early childhood workers in Massachusetts.
That's a great question. I know that EEC is kind of adding to a data dashboard that does have some information on workforce growth over time. I'm not sure if there's specific data tying that growth and investment to particular programs, but folks at EEC might have more information. But I'll put the link to the dashboard in the chat. Question on funding for professional development. The question is if funding for professional development, say the same amount, did not increase. I think that the answer is yes, but maybe no as well. We see the funding levels for different higher education supports, like career pathways, be maintained. Funding for, as I mentioned, the loan forgiveness and scholarship programs were not included. But something important to track will be how the House and Senate respond to the $100 million in the supplemental budget. That is, workforce is one of the key areas there that could be used to for that funding. Okay. If there are no more questions, thank you everybody again for joining. I'm going to put my email in the chat as well if anybody would like to reach out or send questions later on that come to you. Happy to discuss further. And thank you again, everybody, for joining today. Have a great week.